Well, good evening, everyone. Our webinar this afternoon, or this evening, actually it's a little bit later than that for us, is dealing with opposition to equestrian trails. And it's a presentation by Mark Flint with Southwest Trail Solutions. Mark, if you could forward that. Our webinar this evening is brought to you by My Horse University and Equine Land Conservation Resource.
And all of a sudden, technology
is failing.
Yeah, we just went through it and none of the buttons work. Let me try another one.
Okay.
Mark, go ahead and just left click on your screen and then try and go ahead. There you go.
There we go.
Right. That's the trick you told me about.
Yeah, so the Equine Land Conservation Resource is celebrating our 20th year. So our mission, if you can flip to the next screen. Oops.
Sorry. Yeah,
that's all right. That's your scroll button.
Yep.
We are the only national nonprofit organization dedicated to helping horse enthusiasts and their local organizations and communities to advocate successfully for their equine lands, facilities, and trails through education, organization, collaboration, and action. And there is our website connection right down at the bottom of the page there. And if you can flip to the next screen, we have 6 issues that we focus on. Planning for horses in your community, that's all the planning and zoning issues that come up. Conservation tools for horse land, where we talk a lot about conservation easements and other tools. Access to public lands, access to private lands, best management practices, and benefits of horses to our communities. We are working on another educational module, so to speak, and that is going to be organizational development. That's a direct offshoot from the survey that we initiated in 2017, 2018, and was one of the recommendations that came out of the survey report. So, in dealing with opposition to equestrian trails, Mark Flint is a professional trail designer and owner of Southwest Trail Solutions in Tucson, Arizona. His company has designed trails in Vermont, Nevada, Texas, and is soon going to be doing a major project in Mexico. Working as a trails program coordinator for Pima County, Mark was heavily involved in the design and construction of the Arizona National Scenic Trail in southern Arizona. Mark has a good feel for all-around trail use and users. Growing up on cattle ranches, Mark was riding horses from the time he could walk and worked as a cowboy before opting for a more secure career choice. He has been an avid mountain biker, hiker, and backpacker, focusing last on his first transportation of choice, horses. Mark is a chief regional steward for the Arizona Trail Association and is author of Desert Trails, Designing and Building Trails in a Harsh and Demanding Environment. Mark, take it away.
All right, thank you, Denise. I currently live in Tucson, Arizona, moved here in 1997, and at that time I was still in my prior career of journalism and communications. And I did that for about 30 years. In 2002, I was able to find a way to escape that yoke and do what I really loved, which is trail building and designing. As I got more involved, the skills I had learned in communications really proved useful. Initially, primarily for organizing and promoting volunteer events, and then later dealing with people who objected to new trails. And that's what we're going to be talking about for the next 45 minutes or so. Obviously, if nobody objected to trail plans, we could all go home right now. But most trail projects I've been involved with have had some opposition, if only because some people don't like change. The most effective way to prevent opposition from derailing or seriously impeding a trail project is to ensure there is none, or that it's so minimal that it's really not significant. Communication and organization, long before any plans are made, can go a long way to ensure that you have a broad base of support for your trail projects. And by following a few simple steps, you can develop a support network that not only ensures success, but has side benefits of getting more volunteers and even funding for your project. Who in your community is going to join you? This means thinking about casting a really wide net. User groups are the obvious one, but there's a lot more than that available to us. Trails benefit our economy in quite a few ways, including tourism and providing quality of life enhancements that attract new businesses. Economic development groups, local chambers of commerce, and hospitality business community, should be pretty easy to bring on board. Service clubs are great, and the ones I've been to are always looking for speakers, so it's pretty easy to get on their agenda. The healthcare industry is another big supporter of trails, and often you can get grants or small grants or donations, even from local hospitals. Because trails provide opportunities for people to exercise and enjoy a healthy lifestyle. So hospitals, public agencies, mental healthcare providers all benefit from trails. And just a little side note on that, in Japan, there's actually a prescription given for people who have anxiety and depression, and it's called a walk in the forest, often referred to as forest bathing too. So it's definitely helpful for emotional health. Schools and colleges use trails for environmental education. A lot of them have community service projects. We certainly utilize those here in Tucson, and one of our trail systems became a high school cross-country running course as well. So that's another base of support. One of the things that's helpful as you bring these people together is to have an overarching umbrella group. If one doesn't exist in your area, it might be worth considering trying to put one together. The Southwest Colorado Trails Roundtable is a really good example of one, and there are others. We have one in Tucson called the Team of Trails Association as well. Okay, you've built that solid base of support. What's next? It's time to get your do a little bit of homework. So the benefits of trails. When you talk about the benefits of trails, when I talk about them, my elevator speech is that trails improve our physical, emotional, and spiritual health. They can be significant forces behind economic development. They give communities a boost to quality of life and are excellent tools for protecting resources. Now that took me less than 20 seconds to say. So when the elevator door opens, I can step out knowing I got my message across. Oops, did it jump on me? Let me go back. Yeah. Repetition really is key to getting a message across. So what may seem like evangelizing is actually good communication. But if you see eyes glazing over and people crossing the street to avoid you, you might want to consider ratcheting it back a little bit. You can find a lot of good research to document benefits, and one of my favorite go-tos is the American Trails website. I also would highly recommend, if you don't already, supporting that organization because they do a lot of good work. Cultivating local media. Everything in business and politics is about relationships, pretty much everything in life. You want to get ahead of things by having good relationships with local media. This is really important if there turns out to be something controversial come up in any project you're doing. You want the newspapers to already know you, trust you, and come to you. So get out, meet your local media representatives, environmental reporter at the newspaper, local television news staff before you need their help. And that way they'll come to you, and they already know that they can trust you, and that's really money in the bank. A few tricks that I learned as a newspaper reporter. If you're trying to, a reporter trying to reach you, they very well may be on deadline, and the sooner you can get back to them, the better, and the more reliable you come at doing that, you become at doing that, they will reach out to you more often. So in the story tips are, it's good to offer them, but you don't want to give too many of them, because you'll kind of fire hose them, and they really, and you can learn what they want by watching what they air and what they report. But avoid fire hosing them all the time, because then they'll be avoiding your calls. The other thing is exclusive. Sometimes you'll hear this term. An exclusive is a story that you just give to one outlet, and the sort of the accepted standard kind of fair practice on that is you don't offer exclusives to anybody. If they come to you with a story, then that can be an exclusive. But if you want to get something out to the media, you can't play favorites. You give it to everybody. Okay, you've set the table. You've got the media. You've got your support network. You're educated. You've been educating people, and now it's time to actually get down to doing the communication. It starts with an internal process that you may or may not be involved in as a user group, but it's good to know how that works, if nothing else, to avoid getting frustrated with agencies that seem to take so long. But I do part-time trails program coordination for Pima County here in southern Arizona, and we begin after we decide we want to put a trail system in a certain area, maybe something the county recently acquired, by internal communications. We go to all the relevant departments that may have a stake in it. For sure, Pima County has something called the Office of Sustainability and Conservation, and they have an overall sort of guideline for open space conservation, and we work with them to make sure that we are following those guidelines. Your transportation department may have roads near there that need to know about it, especially if you're going to put crossings in. Our real estate department, there's a long list, and we have a little checklist where we send out just a brief description of what we're doing, and that takes a while. And we try to speed it up, but it still adds time to the process. And you may have, as a result of that process, some changes in your plan. But at this point, after you've done that agency step, you may want to bring in stakeholders. We certainly like to. These are people who might be environmental groups, user groups, special interests, people that have come to us and said, I just really want to be involved in your trail. So we bring them in sort of to preview. And that's the next. And then partners are kind of a higher level of stakeholders. For Pima County, the Sonoran Desert Mountain Bicyclists have been a hugely supportive partner. We're just now beginning to work on a trail project that is funded by an $80,000 grant that they obtained through RTP funds. So you want to make sure that number one, be a partner, and number two, be valued to the land manager. But having gone through those three phases, we now have a plan that may have been modified, and it's important, I feel, at least with my agency hat on, that you really try to accommodate any recommendations they make or suggestions. And then you go out and what we call ground truthing. You get out on the ground, you take the concepts, and you make a GPS track and find out what works and what doesn't in the trails you've laid out. I think I've laid out somewhere between 200 and 300 miles of trails, maybe more. I kind of don't count. But I can still remember the one trail that actually overlaid the concept line almost exactly. That happened one time, 1 mile. So there'll be a lot of changes from the concepts to reality, but that's just how the process works. All right, it's ready to go public. Now, if you take a look at the photo at the bottom, you're going to see a public meeting format that most of us no longer use. It's the standard, it's the old where somebody stands up in front and talks, and you can see he's got some staff people who are probably talking to, and the audience is sitting facing all the speakers. And this creates an us-them dynamic, which is really something you don't want. You want it to be all us. It's not conducive to positive interaction. And the other real problem that can come with this is you have opponents who can and will attempt to hijack the meeting. They'll get the mic, and then they'll just start going on, and it becomes really uncomfortable to get the mic away from them. So, and we use the other format, which I'll go to in a second, at one of our meetings, and a couple of people who were very upset about us not allowing everybody from every house bordering our park boundary to have their own trail in. They were very upset that we didn't have that format because they were denied the opportunity to hijack our meeting. And the other drawback of this particular kind of meeting is that it basically holds the audience captive for the entire length of the meeting. Now, if you look at the picture at the bottom here, this is an open house format where you'll have several stations with displays and staff, and a lot of times volunteers who help the staff talk in small groups to people. You can have that face-to-face conversation. You can answer questions, and it really works well. People come in, they gather the information they want, they submit written comments, and then they leave. You need to make sure they're well publicized. We do mailings, press releases, media. Social media is very important and becoming more important if you want to really reach a lot of people. So don't forget that. And if your organization isn't equipped to put on this kind of meeting, you can get a grant for assistance from the National Parks, Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program, which will, as part of what their little menu of services is, helping to organize and put on these meetings. And we've used them. They're excellent. They're an excellent organization. So in the interest of transparency, you want to make all records of the meetings and the comments available. Numbers of people who attended, all comments don't have to each individually be there. Sometimes if there are a lot of them, we'll sort of lump them and say, 5 people said that we're going to kill too many animals building the trail, and 43 said they really love it. And then another, don't stop at the public meetings. Go out to local homeowner groups, neighborhood associations, all of those people who may want to hear about it. The most critical of those would be homeowner groups and neighborhood associations in housing developments that are really close to the project site, because that's where you're most likely to find your opposition when it comes down to it. Handling objections. This is the one that takes the most preparation because it can be the most volatile, and it's also the least fun in my experience. And a few years ago, we had one open house meeting about 2 trail systems, and fairly lightly attended and very positive, and we were headed to the next one thinking it would be another piece of cake. And we walked in and the room was full, and atmosphere was torches and pitchforks. There was 35 people there, and you could feel the hostility. It became pretty clear as the meeting went on that someone had gone door to door, spread a lot of information, most of it not true, and most of it designed to make people very afraid of this project. And it was really challenging. I just had to stay calm and just answer each objection, explain, no, that's not quite how it works. And by the time the meeting was over, almost everybody was at least grudgingly like, well, okay, it's not as bad as we thought. And we still had opposition on this project. And we had vandalism to our machines we were using to build trails, you know, gates that we put up broken, and I could go on and on about all the things that the vandals did. But the system has now been in place for 6 months, and this particular one is a competitive course for mountain bikes and trail runners, and it's that network of trails is closed to the equestrians for safety, but all other users are allowed on it. We do have trails out there for horses as well. But it took a lot of our time to answer all the objections. Right now, I'd say the attitude is grudging acceptance, and I think it'll improve from there. We had to go out in the community a lot and find people who'd listen to us. Now the wounds seem to be healing, and not everybody was on the warpath about it. We had a number of neighbors who said they love the trails, they're glad to see what we're doing out there. But I did want to give an example from this one, since it's so fresh in my memory, that we did have an issue. We had closed the gate to an old road that went up a hill and ended. And we found somebody had just driven around the gate, destroying vegetation to get in, and then they cut a fence that we put up. So I got to talking to one of the people that we had kind of built a relationship with, and he told me that there was a 80-year-old man who used to drive his quad up that road and still liked to just every morning go up and take in the view. It's a pretty spectacular view of the surrounding mountains. And so right on the spot, I gave him a key to the gate lock and said, tell him he can go in anytime he wants. And so as a result of doing that, number one, the fence cutting and the vegetation damage stopped. And both the person that I gave the key to and the man who drove the quad think a lot more of us now. So that was the kind of thing that it's really important to try to do in these situations. So what does opposition look like? I'm pretty sure all of us have a pretty good idea of that. But it can come from a neighbor who resents change. It could be someone who's fearful of crime. And we get some complaints. Oh, people are going to, you know, they're going to go up and they're going to stare down into my yard. You know, it's hard to explain that, you know, most of us who go out on trails go out to get the heck away from that kind of stuff. We don't want to look at houses. We want to experience nature. But you'll still hear that. And there's one of our more common ones is also fear of harm to wildlife. Even though most projects are surveyed by wildlife biologists to prevent those serious impacts. I think that the resistance to change is pretty much the underlying, and it seems to be human resistance. It's underlying cause of most of our opposition. And it can be, you know, people have been recreating, neighbors have been recreating on the property and using social trails created by themselves or other people, and they've gotten to view it as their own private playground, and they don't want a lot of people coming in, even though it's, you know, public land. There could be other issues at play. In the case that I gave you of all the hostility, urban sprawl has kind of moved out into that area, and people who move to get away from civilization are finding it creeping in. And so that our trail project, and this is just my kind of personal assessment, but I suspect that it became the face of that threat to their lifestyle, you know, and it was a surrogate they could attack, and we're the government, what the heck, you know. And the reality is that trails are a way to manage that growth in an area, because they're going to come anyway, so your choice isn't to keep them out. That's not an option. They will come, and unless you have, you know, law enforcement posted out there 24/7, they will get out there. So then your best option is to manage it, and that's what we use our trails for. So in looking at the underlying causes of opposition, it's number one, it's good to understand and feel some empathy, understand what they're going through. And the other thing that we try to do is make adjustments where it's feasible. On that particular project of a competitive mountain bike course, I invited people to come with me as I was doing the design, and a few did, and one came out when I was designing near his home, and he said, you know, I just think that's too close to my house. Now, it was a good 500 or 600 feet away, and there was a lot of vegetation shading, but, you know, instead of arguing and saying it's okay, I just said, you know, let's take a look. And we managed to move it another couple 100 feet away from his home, and that made him a supporter, you know. So being flexible as much as you can, as long as you don't compromise sustainability and the integrity of your system, it can be really helpful. Okay, now that troll down in the lower right. This is one of the things that is challenging for me to try to remember, but avoid being drawn into arguments over impact, or what they call in social media, feeding the trolls. Number one, they're not going to change their mind. They want to get your attention, and they want to monopolize your time. When it comes to environmental impacts, most jurisdictions use the NEPA process, which is the National Environmental, Protection Act, that requires surveys of biological and cultural / historical resources to make sure that the trails, that the whatever is being done will not have a negative impact. And if it does have a seriously negative impact, some kind of mitigation is necessary. In our case, we generally just go out with a biologist and archaeologist and move the trails when that comes up. But I basically am trying to come around, instead of, giving my reasons why it really doesn't hurt them, and say, we hire biologists, wildlife biologists to come and look at that, and these people know what they're doing, and we just trust their judgment, and that's what we pay them for. So if you want to argue, you're welcome to go argue with them. All right. This is another hard part for me, because, I want everybody to be happy with as happy with the trails as I am. And you can't. You need really to stay a little bit detached and not take it too personally. And when the comments come out, and as I said, it's easy to say and hard to do that. And I just take it as a message from the universe that I still have a lot of work to do in that area. But if, like me, you sometimes find yourself, kind of get wrapped up in the negativity, and you're rerunning scenarios in your head as you're trying to go to sleep at night, and, some of the often ignorant and hurtful comments that come your way. It's one of the techniques I try to use is just reframe that experience a little bit and remind myself why I do this. I'm providing, and we are all trying to do this, provide a significant enhancement to people's health and enjoyment, and, do economic benefits to our community. And it's inevitable that people are going to be in opposition to some of these projects. And some of that opposition can be downright ugly at times. Although most of the time, and that example I gave is a rare one. It's kind of an outlier, but it does happen, and we do get the fear mongering about crime and some of the other issues that are really non-issues if you look at the research. But if you've done your groundwork and you've been transparent in the process, and you have communicated effectively to the public, those entrenched opponents, they'll be a little isolated. They won't have the effect that they might have had you not taken those steps to be prepared. And the anger will go away, and you'll feel good about your contribution to your community. And that's the real thing that I'm hoping that everybody will take away from this. And so now let's jump right into questions and answers.
Okay, I had to unmute myself there. I've got a few questions here. Some of them came in through Q&A and one or two through our chat box, and then I've got a couple of others. I'm going to start with Lorraine Harrington, who asks, can you give us some examples of service clubs?
Yes. Rotary is one that I've spoken to a lot. Lions, some communities have JCs. Any service club that is out trying to do work in the community, and you can usually, they're pretty easy to find.
What would be the advantage of working with the service clubs?
Well, you're just basically you're getting the word out. You have more people who know what you're doing. You might get some volunteers. A lot of times service clubs are looking for projects to support with funding. So, but mostly it's just sort of spreading the gospel of the benefits of trails.
Right. Okay.
Or about specific projects.
Yes. All right. I have a question in the chat box. Christine Skelly has asked, can you discuss changing equestrian trails to shared trails, bikes, etc.? What are the pros and cons and design considerations?
Okay, it's almost all pros as far as I'm concerned, because I think shared trails encourage people to be courteous. There are issues that come up in every user group. There's always a knucklehead or two, and you're going to run into that no matter what. But yeah, and it depends also on the culture in the area. In southern Arizona and where I came from in Oregon, the equestrians and mountain bikers in particular got along really, really well. So that's never been an issue. I ride shared trails a lot and have never had a negative experience with a mountain biker. Had a couple of close ones where they came in a little hot and my horse jumped, but you know, they apologized all up and down, and I said no problem. But as far as so about the shared trails, I highly encourage it. Number one, if you have all your trails that are shared, everybody has a lot more mileage of trails that they can enjoy. There are some trails that just by sort of selection where you run into a lot of mountain bikers or a lot of hikers. I like to get away from, I mean, I get out on trails to get away from people and civilization anyway, so I go a little farther out. So there's some of that happens just naturally. As far as the design aspects, there are a couple of things. When we design and when we build almost all of our trails, except the one I mentioned that we build in Pima County, and most of the ones that I work on within my business are shared use trails. So a few things. Of course, sustainability is just critical, and damage to trails, right, is not caused by user type. It can be caused by the number of users, but usually 90% of it is really water. So it's water management, keeping the water from flowing down the trail, making it flow across. Then when you talk about making trails for equestrians and multi-use, a couple of things. I mean, you've got runners, dog walkers, hikers, slow people, fast people. So a few things that we can do. Number one, of course, is you have the head clearance for horses. You prune to a good 10 feet above the trail. You want to make sure, especially in areas where here, when you bump into the vegetation, you're going to get something sharp go into your skin. We want to make sure that the vegetation is far enough away that when you straddle a horse, you're not going to hit a cactus. Then one of the other things, when we talk about safety, is I will often, especially if I know it's going to be a high-use trail, I will design what we call calming devices that force bikes to slow down, a tight turn or a technical section, and sight lines as well, so that people can see each other. Do a little pruning of vegetation, maybe across the corner, so you can see somebody coming.
Mark, do you find that discussing the design aspects of trails, like right at the beginning of your project, helps to negate some of the opposition that might be coming up by other users who expect that they're not, for some reason, going to be able to use the trail with the other users?
Well, we do cover that. We cover the design, two aspects of it. Number one is sustainability and safety. Mm-hmm. And number two is that users get along. They have to do some of that work themselves to get along.
Right. Okay, let's go on to our next question. This is Jay Ziegler. He says, we have a project that has straight line trails that are slated to close after we build the new trails. Turns out this is a favorite to runners and bikers. They don't seem to care about sustainable trails. Big issue. How do you handle this?
Well, it's, again, preaching that gospel of sustainability again and again so people understand. And usually, you know, an unsustainable trail, after a while, it's no fun to run or bike on because water's running down and eroding it out, and you have social trail development to get around it. Most mountain bikers are pretty aware of this, and if they're not, there are certainly places where they can go to learn more about it. The other thing, and I've had not necessarily that, but there was one trail reroute that we did to take a trail out of a sandy wash, which is pretty good habitat, especially in the summer because it's cooler for especially the, well, javelina and smaller critters especially, but even deer will go in and lie down under that brush in the cool sand. So we took it up out of the wash, and there was a great amount of hullabaloo from a number of mountain bikers. It's, I love the challenge of riding that wash. You're sanitizing the experience, but we stuck to our guns and put it in. We did leave about a half mile of that wash unblocked so that they could go up it if they wanted to. But as time passed, nobody rides the wash. The trail's too much fun. And that's what will happen too. If the trails are designed right with sinuosity, most people don't like the straight lines. I mean, that's what we go out in nature to get away from. If they want to do that, they can go out and ride on the road and run on the roads. But a nice sinuous trail that sort of flows with the contours of the landscape is a much more pleasant experience. And every mountain biker that I know prefers that to a straight line trail. So the short answer is a lot of education and explaining why sustainability is important as a resource protection element.
Great. Okay, next question from Lisa Stevens in Austin, Texas. She asks, how do you suggest designing your trails to prevent loss of the trails to fast bike riders? This has happened to hundreds of acres in Austin, Texas.
Part of that I mentioned in the calming devices, and we do have, there's a growing problem. I'm sure most of you have heard of it. There's an application called Strava where people can compete for time. So instead of having races on trails, you have individuals going out trying to make a faster time than somebody else or than their last one. And I've seen these riders, and I know exactly what they're doing because they've just come barreling down the trail, not even looking. And again, design for calming devices, sight lines, and education to the mountain bike community. And one of the reasons we developed this competitive course was we can tell the mountain bikers, look, if you want to ride fast, there's a place for that. Go there. So that would be another option, is to actually develop a couple of really well-designed, competitive, high-speed courses for bikes and push the people over to those.
Okay. Next question from Joanna Sasso. She is with the Muttontown Horsemen's Association, and she asks how to get help preserving trails in a private property that is applying for a subdivision. Trails on the property date back to 1915. We have been appearing before the planning board asking them to be sensitive to the trails that have existed for years.
This can be a tough one because basically property owners can do whatever they want. However, a couple of things that come to mind immediately, and one is that trails have become the new golf course. A lot of developers are putting in trails. They're cheaper to build and maintain, and people want them. They want to go out and walk paths and, push strollers and run and bike. And so approaching the landowners and explaining that it's a benefit that also increases property values, and that if they keep them open to the public, they are exempt lawsuits if anything happens, as long as they don't charge for it. Almost every state, I think every state has owner liability exemption for recreation trails.
Yeah, every state but one. Can't remember which one that is, but there's still one holdout. Yeah.
Right. I haven't been there, and I'm not going there.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay. Push that one along. Lorraine Harrington asks, has your Trails Implementation Organization ever been sued? Were you able to get funding or a grant or pro bono legal help to respond? That's a very specific question.
Yeah, no, Congress has not, I know, have been sued for trails. There are issues on the roads where bicyclists have been seriously hurt and killed, and there have been lawsuits. And actually, I did it for a while. I did expert witness testimony in this field, and until, no offense to attorneys, but the personal injury attorneys are too hard to be around. But anyway, there are those, and there's insurance to cover that, and I carry insurance for my work, but never even a hint of a lawsuit or anybody unhappy to that degree. I know there are attorneys who are mountain bike riders and road riders who help with legal issues and will help clubs.
That would be good to know.
Yeah, and one of the issues for equestrians is the whole thing about insurance and the cost of insurance, and I know there are people working on it, and I am too, to get better coverage and less kind of restrictive as well. Right.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very helpful as things move along to have some alternatives in insurance, and just make sure that everybody is well covered, but that it's not costing a fortune. That's kind of a tough balance to create. Okay, let's go on to the next question. This is Debbie Briscoe from New Hampshire. We are currently trying to develop a relationship with a land trust. We feel they are worried about horses damaging trails much more than any other user, and have mentioned that worry about clearing height.
Okay, well, the second one is pretty easy. It's no big deal. You reach up and lop her stuff off. One thing I would recommend is that get involved and offer to do that height clearing maintenance yourselves. Take that worry away from them. And that will also cement more of a partnership approach. As far as horses damaging trails, as long as they are not on them when they're wet, and as long as the trail is built sustainably, it's really not an issue. And there's a lot of research that you can find to support that. So it seems like they're worrying about something without really knowing, and maybe it's an excuse to say no at sort of a default no position. But I would press forward.
And she asks also, what is the best approach to this land trust to develop a better understanding about horse trails?
A couple of things that I would do is I'd try to sit down with them, number one, and just talk about the issues and see really where they're coming from. And the other thing that can be really nice is invite one or two of them to join you on a ride and explain, why you do what you do and the benefits of it, and how it's a great way to experience the outdoors, and that equestrians can be great partners.
Good. Okay, Ann Schilling asks, can you give more examples of overcoming objections of neighboring landowners who have assumed that a vacant area was kind of their own private yard and don't want large numbers of the public there.
Yes, sometimes the only thing you can do is say, look, we're really sorry, but this is public land and it's going to come in. You know, this is not your property, I realize. But, and the other thing that we will tell them is, this property had been slated for development. You would have had a bunch of houses sitting out here. So, you know, you might want to consider being grateful that it is just this. You know, another issue that we have, and I'm sure equestrians will encounter this too, there are a lot of land that is leased by cattle ranchers. And a lot of state trust land in Arizona, 9+ million acres. Cattle ranchers tend, in a lot of these, they've been there for a long time, they start thinking they own it. And I've actually had people tell me they've been told they're on private property and have to leave when they're on state or county land. So that's another one. And again, it's just educating, make sure the people out there know. But some people, you're not going to convince them. And you just have to hope that there's just a couple of them. And it's also, you know, when it comes out to the public and they're saying, I want to have this for myself, that's not really a good look. So they're kind of basically shaming themselves, saying, yeah, I'm selfish.
Yeah, and I think that bringing people into kind of the planning process and having them understand a little bit more about what it is that you want to do to design to include there may hit a little, you know, a little idea of being happy that something in particular is going to happen there. And then again, it may not, but it's worth a try.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It reminds me of Parks and Recreation, but I'm not going to go into that. Watch it. Okay, Susie Zierton asks, have you worked with private landowners that are near your trails? Do you suggest easement or acquisition if required for your trail system?
We try to avoid it if at all possible, because it can be touchy. We have one trail that's been in existence for a long time, and we're actually going to have to, a guy from California bought the land, and the trail goes across like 800 feet of his property, and we looked at rerouting, and it would have cost $25,000 to $50,000 because it's very tough terrain. Mm-hmm. So we're actually going through a condemnation proceeding, which is something you really want to avoid if at all possible, because believe me, they're not happy about it. But there are others where we're working with private landowners in an equestrian area out in the Rincon Valley, for those of you who may be a little familiar with the Tucson area. And we're just initiating that one. We do have a plan B for moving it over to public land, state trust land, and purchasing an easement. But we definitely work with them. Some are open and some are not. And if they're not, you really don't have a lot of options. You can condemn, but most of the times your agency is really not going to want to do that, because it's really, there's no winners when you do that.
Yeah, leaves a lot of bad feelings sometimes if they really don't want to do it. Okay, next question. Nancy Spratt says, I am with Horse Council, British Columbia in Canada. Hello, Canada. Here in BC, conversion from rails to trails is in full swing, and we find that municipalities through which newly converted trails run are tending to disallow equestrian use. Can you speak to ways to influence inclusion? Thanks.
Well, 3 words come to mind right away, and that's education, education, education. Mm-hmm. I would sit down with them. I would, ELCR has a lot of information about the benefits of riding horses, and that's one of the things that people really need to know more about, the therapeutic benefits of riding a horse, the health benefits, and that it's a legitimate and historic use. So and the other thing that you can do too that can help is try to be partners. And the mountain bike movement began after all the other users were on the trails, and mountain bikers, and I was a big part of this, had to earn our way onto the trails through what we call sweat equity. And that's another way to earn the respect of land managers. So I would encourage getting out, doing maintenance, helping with in whatever way you can with local trail systems and with agencies that are going to be building new trail systems.
And Nancy, we have a Rails to Trails section in Kentucky that, and we're kind of behind on trails here, but there's been some big movement in incorporating some of that Rails to Trails. It's called the Dawkins line, DAWKINS. I think if you go to Rails to Trails Kentucky, you can see kind of what happened there. If you can't find it, just give me a call in the office. Our phone number is on the website, and I'll give you some more information on that. Okay, Lisa Height. Hi, Lisa. We're in an area where a group had purchased land to build trails that originally planned for equestrian trails. After the project was completed, the trails were not available to horses. Do you have advice on how to go back and make a case to include the horse trails originally proposed? The project is still developing more miles of trails.
Well, I think the first thing I do is go back to sort of the beginning of this presentation and start to develop a broad network of people who support you. Try to find other trail users who may be open to the idea of sharing with equestrians. And a lot of people, I don't mountain bike much anymore, but I horseback ride, I hike, and I used to mountain bike a lot. And, I love all three of those uses. And there are a lot of people like me who do that, who ride bikes or hike as well as ride a horse. So find those people. I would recommend really trying to build a network. And then also, I would want an explanation as to why something was offered and then pulled back off the table. And a lot of times there's political machinations that are curious, but I would certainly still want to look into that. And again, just communicate and build that network up.
Thanks for that question. Okay, Pauline Singleton asks, where the soils are sandy, the bikers often produce a rubboard effect that can become uncomfortable for a horseback rider. Sometimes bikers seem to enjoy the up and down effect and not only don't slow down to prevent making it worse, but probably enjoy seeing it get worse. I guess it's more exciting for them. Any way to mitigate this effect?
Well, I'm not sure who the ownership is. If it's a public agency, I would sit down with them and have a discussion about alternatives to that. Because especially if it becomes not just uncomfortable, but it looks like it could become a safety concern. And there are soil hardeners, there are things you can do that might be a little less difficult for equestrian. We have a lot of sandy soils here, and we're not Florida, but we have a lot of sand, and we basically try to get up a little bit on a hill where you're above it.
Okay. Our next question is from Jennifer. Are you familiar with the Walnut Creek Ordinance regarding protecting existing trails from development in California? Is it still effective? Same legislation was helpful in Pennsylvania. I now live in Virginia and want to get something similar here. Thanks, Jennifer Alexander.
Yes, I'm not familiar with those, but actually right here in Pima County, we have the Eastern Pima County Regional Trails Master Plan, and that is an ordinance. So it is a legal document, and every trail on it is protected. And you can get a hold of those plans. You can work on getting them implemented, and that's the approach I would take. It's an excellent thing to do because trying to undo development is pretty much impossible. But the county requires that if a developer does develop, and they have to provide an alternative to that trail. If they want to move it, that's fine, but they can't just close it.
That's a good question, Jennifer. Why don't you give us a call in the office, and we'll see if we can delve into that a little bit further, find out what the current status of it is. Okay, Lorraine Harrington has another question. Our potential lawsuit is not about liability, but about private property rights. Landowner may challenge existing easement. Good question.
Yeah, and that really depends, you know, on the easements themselves and the law in that area. I do know that we had a case here where that happened, but the guy, I mean, the easement had been in since the late 1980s, and a development came, and he decided he didn't like the trail behind his house and tried to close it off. And I was always going back and reopening it. We finally got through to them, and that ended because an easement should be pretty hard to reverse. But there are some private property rights movements that are working to try to overcome those. And I know there are some that, you know, that people don't want rails to trails for reasons I don't understand. But.
Yeah, I think we run into issues with privacy and just the perception, especially when land changes hands, that something has been going on there, that that somebody's using their land for quote unquote free, and they just don't like it. And it could be somebody that's bought the property for investment, or it could be somebody that's bought it to live there, and they just perceive that anybody utilizing their property is going to really disturb their peace and privacy and create liability. Okay. And Nancy Spratt says, thank you. We find the greatest objections are to manure, actually. And that is true. Would you like to address that at all?
A little bit, yes. And number one, some of that is education. Of course, here in the desert, it dries so quickly, it's not a big issue. Right. But one thing that I'm coming to, you know, as far as I'm concerned, the biggest problem comes from riding on wet trails and the post holes. That's the most upsetting thing. But the manure issue, I mean, people bring it up, and I say, really, get over yourself. But there's also something that can be done. And, you know, when I grew up, I was taught you don't let your horse stop. You just keep them walking. And that strings it out and makes it less objectionable. And I would encourage people, sort of encouraging club members to do that when they're on trail, because if it's spread out along the trail, it doesn't have the same impact.
That's a good point. I really hadn't thought of that specifically.
The horses are fine with that. Yeah, they just need to be trained. It's like training them not to eat while you're riding them.
Right. Well, that's true. Okay, I have a couple of other questions for you. Let's see if we have time. Gwen, how are we doing for time? I think she's there somewhere.
I'm still here. Sorry, I'm still here. So we are at just before 8 o'clock, but if you want to take a couple more questions, that's okay.
Okay. First question, do the agency staff provide assistance in avoiding or dealing with opposition, or do you find that they are more likely to sit back and let you handle it?
It really depends on the agency. Pima County, where I primarily work with an agency, is pretty good about working on that. It just depends on, you know, I've seen some BLM field offices that just freak out if somebody yells at them. It's really, I guess I would say, site specific. But they should. I mean, it's their land, and and the Forest Service that I've worked with, they're like, we don't care if you object, we're putting it in, and you can't do anything about it. You can't sue us. So it really does depend on the agency.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I just want to mention Michelle Emmenheiser. She said, thank you for this webinar, very helpful. Well, thank you for attending. Okay, one more question. Do most communities require an environmental assessment for new or realigned trails?
Yes, I'm going to say yes for most. There are a few. I found my project in Texas, they don't do the NEPA thing. It's a city land, and they didn't do any biological or cultural, and I've done a couple of others like that. If federal funding is involved, absolutely, you're going to be required to follow the NEPA process. and on most other agencies do it, and it's a good thing. I think it should be done. I've participated in projects that don't do it, and I try to watch on my own, make sure that we're not, crossing any cultural sites or, really important habitat. But I would like to see it pretty much accepted that you need to do that. But even basically, and talking about reroutes, a corridor for the trail is cleared usually 20 feet either side of the center line. So you can reroute within that corridor, but if you go outside that very much, you can get away with a few feet. But if you go outside that very much, you need to have it resurveyed.
Okay, well, I think we're at the end of our questions, and we're just about to the end of our time. Just really want to thank everyone for attending. We had very good turnout, and Gwen will let you know when the webinar recording will be available. And we've had a few people ask for that, so that's really great. And I hope that when you do receive word of it, you will spread it around, share with other people that you think might be interested in it, and it helped us to get the word out about protecting our horse lands, facilities, and trails.